This idea that the referendum would end the civil war in the Tory party, it's not going very well, is it?
Well, I never thought that a small majority, a flawed franchise which denied my British mother in Paris a vote, denied my European Union citizen wife a vote, allowed a Mozambican student a vote, sold on a bunch of false promises and a pack of lies that would settle it for the country, let alone the Tory party. So, of course, the decision was taken very early on, immediately after. This was a decisive majority. The British people have spoken. Brexit means Brexit. Mrs. May had a very strident approach in the Lancaster House speech, in the first party conference speech, and so the tone was set for the hardest possible Brexit. And of course, people like myself, who would have happily settled for the softest Brexit, reunited behind that idea of staying in the single market, staying in the customs union, staying as close as possible, we would have, of course, as it were, rolled behind that quite happily. But as it was, the hardest Brexit clearly has meant that the pro-Europeans in the Conservative Party, like myself and others, it's a very difficult place to be. And so, of course, I do welcome recently, in the last few weeks, a reset, a shift in the tone, both in the speeches made in Florence and in the House of Commons, to reach out, to try and stay closer, to have the 2-year transition period. And so I welcome the fact that Mrs. May now has realised that that kind of hostile approach, really the hard Brexiteer approach, which clearly was written into the script by people like Nick Timothy, isn't the way to make friends and influence people amongst the 27. And as you start to realise that 44 years of entanglement are going to be extremely challenging to reverse, and the whole Brexit process is far more complicated than was ever explained to the British electorate during the referendum campaign, it becomes clear to the government and the sensible members within the cabinet that a reset was required. So, of course, I welcome where we are now. We're in the 5th round this week of negotiations, but I don't think it's likely that the green light will be given on the 19th of this month to progress to the phase 2 of the negotiations. I think a lot of work still needs to be done on citizens' rights, on the issue of the Northern Irish border, and of course on the divorce bill itself. So we are where we are, but at least now I have a feeling that the Prime Minister is actually leading the way in trying to have a solution which will keep Britain close and safeguard our economic interests.
So describe for me what sort of Brexit you're now hoping for.
Well, I don't think we're going to get to where I would like to be. I was very keen from day one on what I call the Norway Plus model, i.e. staying in the European Economic Area, i.e. full members of the single market, but also to negotiate a Turkish-style customs union deal so that basically that would solve particularly the Northern Irish Republic border. So that would really mimic being in the European Union in terms of the economic side. And we'd also stay close on foreign and security policy, fighting crime and terrorism. But we would be free, as it were, to reject things if we didn't like them. Norway is still a sovereign country. It doesn't have to take all the legislation if it doesn't want to. It can be a problem, and it very rarely does that. So you have to keep what's called regulatory convergence. We would be able to have our own rules, say, on things like the common agricultural policy, for instance, if we wanted to subsidise our farmers. But again, if we start to do that excessively, it would also be a problem. But it would maintain the fact that we had left the European Union, but we were still, as it were, part of the economic partnership agreements under the existing models which everybody is familiar with and have worked so well for Norway for the last 30 years.
But Norway's a country whose political leaders really want to be in the EU, and that's why they're prepared to accept that settlement where they're having to follow EU rules most of the time without having any role in making those rules. Is that really a model that Britain could possibly embrace?
Well, I don't think being a rule taker rather than a rule shaper is ideal. I'm a passionate pro-European Remainer. I would rather we'd stayed in the European Union. I tried to make that case, but of course the media gave pro-European MEPs very little coverage. I mean, I wrote and spoke extensively when I could. Unfortunately, only people like Farage and Dan Hannan got media coverage during the campaign, and people who actually knew how the EU worked and the good side of it weren't given the opportunity to make that case. And so inevitably, the media was dominated by a very high Eurosceptic content, and the BBC weren't even informed well enough to challenge half the allegations made. And so we do have this scenario where, as John Major put it, that in many ways, the British electorate have been deceived by many of the promises, because clearly, where is the 350 million a week for the NHS going to come from? It's not going to be there. Our economy is going to contract. The City of London, which I represent, is going to have huge problems. Banks are relocating. Jobs will be on the line. So I don't see any sunlit uplands from Brexit, but at least we do need to mitigate the damage. And of course, the model I'm proposing ticks the box of leaving the European Union. It keeps us with regulatory convergence, but it has a big advantage to me as well. If after 5 years of being in that situation, we find that we really were better off being full members, it'd be very easy to reverse back in and reapply to join as full members. If we go off on this hard Brexit trajectory, which is probably why the Brexiteers want it, and we go as far away as possible and think that all our links economically lie with Australia, New Zealand, Canada and the United States, of course it will be much harder to ever rejoin the European Union as it is. So I want us to park ourselves just outside and then decide whether we want to go further away in future or reverse back in. That's my model and my hope.
Would you support the idea of having a referendum on whatever agreement is reached?
I have reluctantly come to the decision that a second referendum may be the only way to try and reach an agreement on the final deal, particularly if it's a bad deal or there's a no deal. I say reluctantly because, as I have shown and predicted, sadly, if there is a split in which there is only a very narrow majority either way, it's not going to settle the issue. I mean, Nigel Farage himself said that 52% Remain, which is what he expected, wouldn't settle the matter for the Brexiteers and the Leavers. We now have the reverse of that. So I will remind people like Farage that why should I feel bound by 51.9% on a flawed franchise and a pack of lies? I don't, but I accept that's legally where we are, that's politically where we are, and that's the position of the government, and so I'm trying to stay as close as possible. But, you know, I think a second referendum has all the risks of the first referendum, or the second one, if you want to say 75 was one, and this is the third. I don't know how you want to enumerate it. The risk of a referendum is that often people vote on things nothing to do with what's on the ballot paper, and often they don't really understand the questions at stake. So it's quite complicated, the European Union, as we've discovered. What I would say is that I think there is more interest and more knowledge about the European Union, what it does for Britain and our economy and our role in the world now after the result and the Brexit referendum than before, sadly, and the media have taken a bigger interest and are prepared to be more critical. So I wish we could somehow put the clock back. I wish David Cameron had decided to hold the referendum now when the Eurozone is growing strongly and Britain is falling behind, and then there would have been a much better picture and understanding of what Brexit really means.
So this, if there were to be a referendum, what would the choice be? Would it be take the deal or stay in, or take the deal or crash out?
Well, that is obviously a very difficult issue. I think personally, I would think it has to. You can only have two questions in a referendum. You can't have three or four. I think that becomes very difficult to reach any kind of conclusion. Even on two questions, it's difficult enough, particularly if it's a narrow majority. No, I think it would have to be accept the deal and package as negotiated by the government, or retain the status quo and revoke Article 50. That would be my suggestion, but of course that's really a matter for the government and a matter for the Electoral Commission to say how the wording would be. But clearly it's very difficult now in Britain, where we have no tradition of referendums in our parliamentary democracy, when we've actually now got a new legal order whereby a referendum basically trumps parliamentary democracy in general elections. The view is that if something is decided in a referendum, only a referendum can reverse it. So that seems to be the way the British Constitution has gone. Personally, I would rather the matter were left to Parliament if that were possible, but clearly most parliamentarians take the view that they are now instructed by a referendum, and even as we saw yesterday with both Damien Green on Newsnight and the Prime Minister with LBC, they basically are saying they would still vote Remain if the whole thing were reworked, but they know that they have been instructed by the will of the people to deliver the best Brexit. So we are in this curious, almost Alice in Wonderland situation now, where people at the top of government are carrying out a policy that they deep down know could well damage the British economy.
If Britain were to say, can we stay in after all, please, what would happen? Would we still have our opt-outs? Would we still have our rebate?
Well, I think that's a very good question, whether clearly at the moment we would still keep all that if we revoked Article 50. If we left and then rejoined, we wouldn't have it, that's clear. But I'm also slightly hopeful, this is a very long shot of course, is somebody like Macron and Merkel. Mr. Macron said he wants to have a whole new architecture and wants to propose some kind of European Union constitution which would accommodate British requirements, or countries which don't feel they want to be part of the faster integrationalist stream or out of the euro. So maybe this is the time for the Europeans, the 27, led by the French and the Germans, to propose something like, let's extend Article 50 for a couple of years, let's have a real sit down and a rethink, not just the negotiations that David Cameron had, but have a new architecture which would accommodate Britain's requirements, and other countries like Britain, like Denmark, or some of the new countries joining, which they are kind of members but not the sort of full membership which is envisaged under the Treaty of Rome. I'm hoping that somebody will take that lead. I'm not hopeful, but President Macron has said that he would like to do something like that, so let's see what he actually comes up with.
And finally, is it just a little bit bizarre that Britain is leaving the EU when almost every other European country that is not currently in the EU is trying to negotiate a close relationship, would, in many cases, would actually like to join?
Well, it's absolutely bizarre, and even David Davis admitted the other day that he doesn't think that many will be following Britain on the Brexit trajectory. I remember Nigel Farage triumphalistically with hubris a year and a half ago in the chamber saying, not only have I delivered Brexit, but I'm also going to bring the whole of this European Union club down, and many other countries will be following. Well, I'm reassured by the results in Austria, in Holland, in France, that the hardline populist Eurosceptics so far have been defeated since Brexit. And in fact, again, paradoxically, the European Union has become more popular since the Brexit referendum across the whole of the European Union. And we even see a small change maybe in the British polls now in terms of, 52% remain. So I don't think actually Brexit has actually done anything for those who wish to destroy the European Union any good, because it's exposed some of the lies, some of the false promises. Because at the end of the day, the European Union, for all its faults, and I've been a member of this Parliament now for 18 years, is a peace and security, prosperity project. It's there to bring better understanding, better prosperity, export stability globally. And if we go back to the kind of nationalist kind of roles envisaged by people like Farage and others, I only see blood and tears as a consequence. So I've always been critical of many aspects of the way this place is run, but deep down I regard Brexit as a selfish and destructive act.